Welcome to the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. We're going to explore ways to sharpen our diagnostic skills, find learning resources, and hear from experts in the automotive field. This episode is brought to you by L1 Automotive Training and Keith Perkins. If you're looking for education on module programming, J2534, EEPROM work, key and immobilizer, electrical diagnostics, or drivability diagnostics, Keith has a website, l1training.com, that's got over 60 hours of training videos on all those subjects and more. When I first started out doing mobile, I utilized Keith's videos on module programming in J2534 in order to get my head wrapped around what I would need for the tooling, the computers, the software setups, what kind of obstacles I would be up against when I'm out there programming modules on cars. And it was a huge benefit to me. And I continue to use the training videos that he has on his website. So I strongly recommend checking out l1training.com. The link is in the show notes. Hey, what's going on, automotive world? Welcome to another episode of the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. My name is Sean Tipping, and I will be your host once again for this week's episode. Thank you so much for joining me. We are going to conclude the 2014 Chrysler 200 with a 3.6 liter that was stalling after a remote start. If you didn't listen to the first half of this, go back one episode and you can hear all about the lead up to where we're at with this thing. I'll give you a brief summary here, but you can get all the details from the previous episode. And I kind of left it mid-diagnosis just to see what you guys would do or your thoughts on it. But we're going to do the conclusion here today of what I found. I think this one's pretty interesting. And I mean, to be totally honest, I don't have all of the answers on this one. Maybe somebody out there listening does. But we got enough of a conclusion for the shop and for the customer. But it is an interesting one. We'll get there. But the brief summary of this one, again, is 14 Chrysler 200 with a 3.6. Customer complaint was stalling engine, but only after they would do the remote start to start the vehicle in the cold. They go out, hop in with their key, and they would turn the ignition to the on position, and shortly after, the engine would stall. It would start right back up, and it would run fine. You could leave it run in the remote state until it would time out and it wouldn't stall. And you could let it idle with the key in the ignition all day long and it didn't seem to stall. Now, again, the customer did note that they had experienced some stalling earlier in the year. We weren't able to duplicate that, but I do have a feeling I know why. I think it is related, even though we weren't able to duplicate it while we were at the vehicle. Anyways, where I was at in my diagnosis was that this thing had no codes and not a whole lot leading me to what was causing the stalling and why it would only be after a transition from remote start to the on position. One thing I do want to note from last week that I said a couple times was a 5-second delay between the time that you went from remote start with no key in the ignition to the key on, and when it stalled, that was a little excessive. Is probably closer to 1 to 2 seconds of time before it would stall. It was relatively quickly, but it wasn't immediate, and I guess that's the point that I want to make. It's not as soon as you rotate the key into the on position that it would stall. There was a short delay period, but it's probably closer to 2 seconds, not 5, and I just wanted to be clear on that. And after I'd gone back to the vehicle and really looked at it, I'm like, yeah, it's not quite as much of a delay as I was thinking it was in my head. But where I had gotten with this in the previous episode, or what I found out, was that I could throttle my way through this. I could use the accelerator and I could give the engine more gas, more load, RPM, and I could prevent it from stalling. Now, that didn't mean that something wasn't happening, and this was the key to kind of lead me towards the solution, was I saw the engine still bog down, even though I was, accelerating the engine. Something was still affecting it. And it would only be for a few seconds, and then it seemed to release, and then you could let off the throttle and it would idle just fine. But in that period, something was happening. But this means a lot to me. I mean, number one, this doesn't seem to be something losing power like an ASD relay or a crank sensor dropping out or anything like that, but something that's physically affecting the engine. And again, it felt like something was loading it down. And, well, there's only so many things that can do that to a running engine. And my first thoughts are, is it something to do with the belt drive, or maybe something to do with the transmission? Now, I am in park, so even if the torque converter was somehow stuck on, it's not going to affect you in park or neutral. You'd only see that in drive and reverse. And I have seen torque converter clutches drag and cause like weird vibrations and seemingly misfires in gear, but not in park and neutral. And that's kind of the key there, is you put it in park and neutral, or you lift the wheels up off the ground and the vibration will go away. It wasn't transmission side. I needed to look at the belt drive. And this is the one last thing that I did while I was there that night, is I went under the hood and I had the technician run the car through its cycle with the key and everything. And I watched the belt drive, and you could watch the tensioner. I actually have a video of it. The tensioner torques over towards the crankshaft pulley when this thing stalls out in the manner that we were referencing after the remote start. Like something on the belt drive is locking up or loading up, causing this to happen. And so I mentioned that to him, and I had him just like turn the key off normally so I could watch the difference. I'm like, yeah, something's up there. And again, there's only so many things that can do this on the belt drive. And I told him, I was like, well, take the belt drive off and spin everything and see, is there anything that feels like there is an issue there? And they said they would do that, and they'll give me a call back. It was the end of the day, so I headed out at that point. So they pulled the belt off. I spun everything, and I was still kind of thinking like maybe an alternator had a one-way clutch on there. What I really wasn't thinking about was the AC compressor. Now, looking back on it, hindsight, given how it was happening, it makes a lot of sense. But I mentioned last week that I had kind of taken the AC compressor out of my mind because number one, I had the HVAC system off. Number two, it was completely empty. It was reading 14 PSI, but I think that's as low as the high pressure sensor on this system could read. But that's at a point in pressure where it shouldn't even be activating the compressor according to the criteria for running the AC clutch. And it's just a clutch on this one. It doesn't have like a variable solenoid or anything. It's just a magnetic clutch for the pulley. It shouldn't even be attempting to turn it on. And in fact, if you tried to turn the AC on with the button in the car, it blinked at you because the HVAC module actually has reference to the pressure in the system. It's basically telling you like, no, something's wrong. We're not turning on the AC compressor. So I had really just taken this out of my mind. I didn't even think about AC. But what they found once they took the belt off is that not the AC pulley, but the internals of the AC compressor were actually seized, which now this is starting to kind of make sense because, of course, the engine's going to run just fine if the AC is not engaged. But if you have a locked up internal to the compressor and then you activate the AC clutch, well, of course it's going to stall the engine. That part of it makes sense. But the question that I still had, and the reason that I needed to go back, was why is it activating the AC clutch? That doesn't make any sense to me. And this is where I got back into the vehicle. They had actually replaced the AC compressor with one that's not seized up. And that did take care of the stalling issue. Now, they did note once they remote started it and went through that cycle that it does activate that clutch, but the system's fully charged now and the compressor's working properly. And really, there is no issue at that point. It's essentially fixed. But I'm still really curious as to why. I am happy to have Automotive Seminars as a sponsor for the show. Now, if you're not familiar, Automotive Seminars is a diagnostic technician training company. They've got a website that there'll be a link to in the show notes. And what they offer is top-notch training to technicians like us in the field. I've been taking their training courses for years and have got a ton of benefit out of it. They've got top-notch instructors, John Thornton, Scott Shotton, Scott Manna, and every other month they've got a 2-night course that you can sign up for. Join in, ask questions, and afterwards, you've paid for the course, you can access a recorded version whenever you want. You can rewatch the class 2 years later in case you wanted some details on it, and that is a fantastic feature. So make sure to check out the website to see what courses they have available and what's coming up in the future. And so when I went back to this vehicle, I talked with the tech and we decided to set this thing up so that it would think that the system was empty. And the way we did this was we took the pressure sensor. It's got a Schrader valve between the sensor and the line. So basically you can unthread this high pressure sensor from the line and you won't lose any refrigerant or very little refrigerant. And then you can just leave the pressure sensor hanging out in atmospheric, which is what we did. So we leave it hang there and it reads 14 PSI. And, now that I say that out loud, maybe it's using absolute pressure instead of gauge pressure. But either way, this is a point where the system is essentially empty as far as the car is concerned, right? We basically just tricked it. The system is full. So if it does activate the compressor, we're not hurting anything. But as far as the computer is concerned, this system is empty. That's its reference to see, okay, is there enough pressure in the system to safely activate the compressor? And you can try this again. If you're just running in a normal state, you press the AC button, the little light blinks. And if you look in there, you can see that it's not allowing it. You have the button input, but the PCM is basically just saying, nope, I'm not turning this on. Totally normal operation. But if I go through the remote start cycle, or I remote start it, and then I turn it on with the key, you can watch the PCM actually turn the AC clutch on for a couple seconds and then turn it back off. Now, in this case, it doesn't stall the engine, but it is turning it on, even though it thinks the system is empty. Because that was the state before when the car originally came in, was the system was empty and the compressor was locked up, but it was turning it on anyways. And then that locked up compressor was stalling the engine. But why is it doing that? So I went through a number of data PIDs to see what was going on, to see is there a request coming from the HVAC module when there shouldn't be? Is the PCM doing something that it shouldn't be? I mean, those are the two modules involved that I can tell that I would even be possible for there to be an issue in this scenario. But I needed to understand how the system was working a little better because there's not much in service info. I even accessed like Chrysler factory service info for this one. Went through like potential star cases, which is kind of like Chrysler's dealership side service bulletins, if you will, and I didn't find anything related to this issue or to the system operation any more than the real basics. Like you can go, I went through the whole HVAC system, AC operation. I went through everything there was on remote start, which really isn't much. There's a generic video that you can watch on Chrysler remote start stuff, and I found that not all of it even really directly applies to this specific application. But anyways, what I found was in the remote start state, right? So you hit the button on the key, it remote starts, the key is off, but the car is running, and you can communicate with a scan tool at this point. The HVAC module does have a request for the compressor to be on in this state, which is interesting because you can leave the HVAC module in the off position and it will still request it. And you can see the request in the PCM, but because the system is empty, the PCM says, nope, I'm not activating the compressor. Now, if we had plugged that sensor in, system's fully charged, it would actually operate the compressor here. And this is part of the remote start strategy. The defrost fan is actually turned on automatically too, even if you don't have that set on the controls. That's the programming that's set up during a remote start on this vehicle. So we have that request, but again, the PCM is correctly ignoring it because it sees the pressure is too low in the system and it's not turning it on. Now, when you go to transition from that remote start state to the on position, I watched the data PIDs, and the request for AC goes to off in the HVAC as soon as you turn that key on. There's really no delay there. But if you go to the PCM side of things, you look at the data PIDs, 1 to 2 seconds after you turn that key on, you see the AC clutch go to on, the commanded state in the PCM. Now, I never saw this when I was looking at the data PIDs, but it's because I really had discounted the AC. I kind of had some tunnel vision there of like, well, there's no pressure in there. It's not going to be activating the compressor because it wasn't. Because I actually tried to activate the compressor and it didn't when I was manually trying to do it. But for a brief moment after the transition, it does. And for some reason, it doesn't matter whether there's pressure in the system or not. Something in the software of the PCM is just saying, all right, let's cycle this compressor. And it only does it for a second, and then it turns it back off. Even though the AC request from the HVAC seems to have gone to no as soon as you cycle that key, until once that HVAC module gets into its regular on state, it releases that request. But does that request still have something to do with it? So I played around with this. I was like, okay, well, I have the HVAC system off. That doesn't seem to make a difference. What if I completely kill power to the HVAC module? Does that change anything? So I pulled the 2 fuses for the HVAC module, went through the process. When I did that, the compressor would never turn on. It wouldn't do that quick cycle after the remote start if I left the HVAC module completely offline. So I was like, okay, well, that definitely has something to do with it, right? That request coming through from the HVAC to the PCM, even though I can watch the data PIDs change, something about that is causing the PCM to turn that clutch on. Now you could say, okay, well, the HVAC module must have an issue there. Yeah, but the PCM software should still block the compressor operation with low pressure. That's a problem too in my mind. And so I messed around with this, and one of the things I did is I looked to make sure, like, do we have a module in this thing that's misconfigured, set up for the wrong option, has the wrong software, something like that? And I couldn't find it. I looked obviously at the HVAC and the PCM, but also at stuff like the cluster and the TIPM. That, like, the TIPM is a gateway module in this, and the cluster is also a medium between a couple of the buses on this vehicle. Everything had the current and original VIN as this vehicle. Everything had the correct software. I think I mentioned last week, I tried, reprogramming the software in the PCM, even though it was already up at the most current level. Didn't change anything. There wasn't any software to put into the HVAC module of this vehicle. Everything seemed to be correct for the application, so I don't feel like I was missing anything there. And keep in mind that if the system is fully charged, the AC system, this really isn't a problem. This only becomes a problem if your AC system is empty. And especially when your AC compressor becomes seized and we're still trying to operate it. Obviously, that's the problem that this has led to. And again, a unique circumstance. You're not going to run into this on every car. Someone would have to be remote starting it with a seized compressor on this vehicle in order to even experience this. Now, they mentioned the stalling earlier in the summer. Might have been the compressor failing at that point. When did the system go empty? That's hard to say. I don't know how long it had been empty for. Was the compressor seized because it had been activated with no system pressure in this state? I don't know. How many times would you have to remote start it for that to happen? That's also hard to say. But you shouldn't operate a AC compressor at all if there's no refrigerant, hence no oil moving through the system. That's obviously going to cause damage. But that's really the only time that this software glitch, as far as I'm concerned, would be an issue is on an empty refrigerant system. A full system, this doesn't matter. Just turns the clutch on for a few seconds and turns it back off. Big deal. And so that's where I'm at with this, is I'm just wondering, is this just a little glitch in software that was never caught on this particular vehicle? Now, if you have a 14 Chrysler 200 or 3.6, I would love to know if yours does the same thing. And you can easily run it through this cycle and see. Or if you have one in the shop, please let me know if it does the same thing. I'm kind of waiting to find one to see if it's the same. I don't know if like a Caravan is going to have the same setup. It's a different HVAC module and a different PCM. So the application could be different. But on a 200 specifically, does this act the same way on all of them? Is it just something that was built into the software that wasn't quite right? And I told him, I was like, well, we can try throwing a module or two at it, but which one do we do, right? Is it the PCM? I mean, like I said, the PCM shouldn't be activating the compressor with empty refrigerant, with no pressure in the refrigerant system. But it definitely also has something to do with the HVAC module, because if I kill power to that, well, then it stops sending its request. So is there something about that request that's doing it? Again, I told the shop, like, if you want to try shotgunning a module, but I'm not really all that confident that anything's going to change. I almost feel like it's going to do the same thing even with a new module. And of course, there's only one way to find that out, is to give it a try. They elected to just, tell the customer, okay, this is the situation. We're going to charge your system and get it all sealed up. If your system runs out of refrigerant, you run the risk of, causing damage to the compressor. But I mean, if the AC system is empty, you have a risk of damage to internal components either way from moisture and stuff. So the real simple answer is just keep your AC system charged. But I am curious to know, is this something on Chrysler's side that is just part of the programming? Or is there something software-wise that really is broken on this particular vehicle? And I may not get a great answer here. Well, I can say I don't have a great answer right now because they elected to just charge it and send it down the road. But if I find another one of these, I will definitely update everybody with the is it normal or not. And then if anybody out there has one, I'd be curious to know if it does the same thing. And then it's a matter of, in that case, okay, well, it is normal. Is it possible to make some sort of software patch for it? You'd have to use some sort of custom tuning setup, like maybe like an HP tuners or something like that. If that's even a possibility, I don't know. But it's very interesting, and it was challenging to get to the solution. Once I'm looking back on it, like the reason it was stalling makes a lot of sense and probably shouldn't have taken quite as long as it did to find it. But the application of that compressor in the state that it was very strange. So hopefully you found that interesting. If you got anything to add to it, feel free to reach out. I'd love to hear from you. But But other than that, let's get out there, start fixing the world one car at a time.